Yeah, so some basic information about Platypus. We are an educational organisation that formed in 2006 in Chicago. Not me personally, not the other members here tonight. That was before our time, but it started in Chicago by international members, and it kind of spread to various countries around the world who started their own chapters. And the New Zealand chapter here at the University of Auckland is a relatively new one. It's only been going for, it was just me for a long time, and then we only got Jamie and Theo in the last couple of months sort of thing. But what we do is we host reading groups where we read about the history of the left and Marxism. We host panels, public fora, where we discuss the history of the left with various people on the left. We host the conversation on the left, if you like, and we host teach-ins like this. We also have our monthly publication, the Platypus Review, where we accept a wide range of voices on the left to publish their views. As for this teach-in, basically what I'm going to cover is the concept of democracy and what it means historically and for Marxism. And what I mean by talking about Marxism, when I say that, what I mean is 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th movement for socialism that was led by various individuals and groups who lived after the time of Marx. So at its kind of numerical height, we might say that's the memory of historical Marxism that we're trying to consider here, and trying to think what democracy meant to those Marxists and what it might have meant in the 20th century and today. And in order to do that, we need to start at the very beginning and look at history. So I'm going to cover all of that. So what I'll begin with is a quote that goes, "In the Western world today, everyone is a Democrat." In the Western world today, everyone is a Democrat. That's a quote by this classical scholar guy called Moses Finley, writing in 1972. And what he's referring to there is not the US Democrat Party, but kind of a small d Democrat, the notion of those who subscribe to the notion of democracy. Democracy here, just to really break things down, we might look to the history of the word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule. So, I don't know, can you guys think of any common sense understandings of democracy that come to your mind? When you think of the word democracy, what do you picture? Voting, yeah. Political parties. Representative democracy. Yeah, sure. Athens, ancient Athens, yeah. So it has a few different meanings, historically speaking. And what Finley is really getting at in that opening quote is this notion of everyone accepting the basic premise that democracy is something that is necessary. The way I like to put it is that democracy is like the letter K in the word knack, whether that means kind of a silent approval of democracy or as an acknowledgement of its necessity. And that's because the world now looks like a liberal democratic society. Democracy here being frequently kind of equated with liberalism, which is a term I'm going to return to. Now, the question is, why would Moses Finley want to point out the obvious about democracy, and why should we want to explore what is manifestly obvious to us? And it really turns on this notion of critique. Critique meaning a kind of exploration of what is in the air, if you like, a willingness to interrogate common sense understandings by reflecting on ourselves subjectively, to try and think through what the baseline is for forming our most ordinary assumptions. Our task here is to question received wisdom, but at the same time to see its grounds for plausibility. That's what people mean when they talk about critical thinking. So today, with democracy being universally supported, even if in a speculative way, we might ask what that means. So when I say democracy might be supported in a speculative way, I mean people might say, like, no, we don't have democracy now. We have the rich and powerful running electoral campaigns on the notion of democracy, but in reality, all they're doing is like drone striking children in the Middle East, that sort of thing, and like suppressing their own kind of the least moneyed parts of their own countries from voting. But nonetheless, there is still this premise that things should be democratic, right? So there's a basic agreement on that point. So what Finlay says that is kind of interesting to contrast against that point is he says that democracy as a word disappeared from popular vocabulary until the 18th century, and after that it kind of crept back as a pejorative term, synonymous with mob rule. So what you actually had was a condition where all of a sudden democracy, starts getting bandied about, but it's kind of like, you Democrat, and that's like kind of an insult. And at the same time, there is this great tradition of liberal democracy that we are familiar with through history books, literature, films, popular culture. This notion that liberal democracy was what brought Western civilization to where it is today, or whatever, right? Why might people think so highly of democracy in this context? Like, if we just don't write it off for a second and just try and explore what they mean on their own terms, to do so from within their own logic. Let's just take a really obvious, famous example, and what I'm thinking of here is Abraham Lincoln with his Gettysburg Address, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, where in his Gettysburg Address he writes, "From these honoured dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." So again, of the people, by the people, and for the people, that commonly cited refrain from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The most important part of that formulation is, of course, government by the people. Yet we have to appreciate, in order to appreciate it, we have to recognize how recent this idea was, even in the time that Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address in the 1860s. In order to do that, I need to go back to this notion of ancient society. So I'm going to cover a little bit of material I covered in my last teaching on the Marxist conception of history, to which this is kind of intended as a follow-up. But I'll cover some of the same points by reading some of the same quotes that are helpful. So this is Louis Menand, who's a cultural critic, summarizing the majority of human history prior to modern civilization. When I say modern, what I mean is basically just to draw a line in the sand, let's say pre-1500, and everything that came before that is ancient. So he writes, in pre-modern societies, the ends of life are given at the beginning of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. In all the ordinary customs and practices of existence, since these are inherited from the past and are therefore worth reproducing, the idea is to make the world go not forward, only around. Right? So that's pre-modern societies, this kind of circular existence, dictated by the rhythms of day and night, of the lunar and solar cycles, of life and death, and the tides of the ocean. Whereas in modern societies, he writes, the ends of life are not given at the beginning of life. They are thought to be created or discovered. The reproduction of the customs and practices of the group is no longer the chief purpose of existence. The idea is not to repeat, but to change, to move the world forward. Meaning is no longer imminent in the practices of ordinary life, since those practices are understood by everyone to be contingent and time-bound. This is why death in modern societies is the great taboo, an absurdity, the worst thing one can imagine. And he goes on to say, for at the close of life, People cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth. This knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the values of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are expungible, meaning to be completely removed, or to remove something unwanted or unpleasant. So he's laid out this distinction of ancient society and modern society. What might we already understand about this kind of broad brush strokes conception of the ancient world? Well, we have the caste system, which in which the world is, or the realm is divided into those who work, those who pray, and those who fight, also known as the three estates, which is like the farmer or peasant caste, the priestly caste, and then the aristocratic or warrior caste. There's also this conception of the great chain of being in medieval society, this kind of natural order which starts with God at the top of the hierarchy, and then under God there's the angels, and under the angels there's humans, and under humans there's animals and plants and minerals and so on. In this kind of ancient conception of the world where everything is in a continual rhythm, there is a way of relating to the natural world that is predicated on a certain kind of freedom, but it's a freedom to be left alone. It's a kind of freedom to merely participate in one's community and to not be conquered or invaded. In this sort of world, you've got entire groups of people, entire populations who have never travelled more than 50 kilometres outside of their homeland and that of their ancestors, except under conditions of war or famine or natural disaster. Seldom is there a man-made reason for people to leave, except for, again, conquest, I guess. Now, what changed in this kind of period that I laid out earlier of 1500 onwards? Well, there were various contingencies, various kind of happenstances that began to change the way that people related to oneself, to nature, and to others. One is the passage around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa, which enabled Western Europe to open up trading routes with East Asia. Another is Columbus's voyages to the Americas, producing a whole load of wealth that flowed into Europe and destabilized the political order there. Feudalism's collapse in what we now call Germany. Also things like the Protestant Reformation under Martin Luther and those who followed him. The invention of the printing press. The other sorts of things that you read about in history textbooks, of course. What were the effects of this, though? New social relations, right? This new ability of people to think of to think of nature, to think of oneself, and to think of others in terms of a human-centric model of the universe rather than a divine or natural order. No longer is the great chain of being deemed relevant to this new modern society. Which is to say that the old forms of life no longer really held currency, or where they held currency, they were deemed inadequate because they couldn't properly explain this new human-centric world that people existed in. And in order to understand what exactly it was about modern society that made it new and different from ancient society, we can look at the term civil society, which people in this period begin appropriating from the ancient world of Greece and Rome. They start taking up the notion of, what does it mean for the people to decide what to do in their own community? What does it mean to have a rule of law, to have a republic? And the word civil society comes from the same root word as our word city or citizen, simply meaning those who live in the towns. Now you had people who lived in towns, of course, in medieval Europe, but largely they were kind of centers of like clerical or church kind of people. It wasn't so much like the centers of trading that we now think of, or when we think of, like, for instance, a port. All of a sudden, in this kind of post-medieval era, when you start getting like trading between the transatlantic kind of trades between Europe and the newly discovered Americas, but also the trading between Europe and East Asia, you start to get like a market or commercial society. And another way of rendering that in the German, and this is a phrase that Marx uses but borrows heavily from the Enlightenment, is Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, which just translates to bourgeois society. And bourgeois here just means the society of the towns, where the lifestyles of those who inhabit the urban centres of the world begins to really speak for how everyone else lives in the world. The effects are widespread. So I've discussed the causes a little bit. In terms of the effects of these new social relations or how they play out, this is an example that Platypus member James Vaughan, who's a history teacher at the University of Chicago, uses, which I find quite helpful, where in terms of relating to oneself, a new kind of way of doing that is in philosophy. And so you've got the example of Descartes, who has, cogito ergo sum, which just means like I think therefore that I am, that famous phrase, which simply means that thought does not come from the divine, but from one's own self. And then there's also one's relationship to nature, and this kind of expression in the likes of the Copernican revolution and Galileo, the notion of like a new way of understanding the solar system, where no longer things worked according to some kind of like religious perspective. All of a sudden things had like a certain rationality to it, but it wasn't like thought through by a divine being. And then finally, the way of relating to others, which found expression in republicanism, the idea of the rule of law, but also classical liberalism and social contract theory. So like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, who are associated with that. Now, I'd just like to capture all of this new cosmology, if you like, this new way of relating to the world, this new human-centric viewpoint. We could call it the social revolution, and that there were all these changes occurring, like a scientific revolution, a philosophical kind of turn as it comes out of theology, an artistic movement and the Renaissance, and so on, that are continually redefining society, so that no longer does freedom really rest upon the notion of returning to an original state of like being free to be left alone, but rather freedom means moving in a forward direction, right? So there's a new natural order, but it's a human-centric, urban-centric, bourgeois natural order. And when we think of the Blood East expressions of this new era coming to terms with itself, and by that I'm thinking of like the Dutch revolt against the Habsburgs, the English Civil War and the 1700s, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. These you might think of as referendums on the social revolution. Bloody referendums, but referendums all the same. And that there's this kind of like new process of becoming that's occurring in civil society that is occurring underneath everyone's noses, and all of a sudden they have to take stock of things. So when they're confronted with something that seems to defy that, like the Stamp Act and the colonies of America, this notion of like being taxed without representation, people are willing to take up arms against King George in order to issue like a kind of a final proclamation on where things are at in this new world order. So a helpful quote to demonstrate this is from the Declaration of Independence, where those who drafted it write, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And the key word there is self-evident. Like, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're not saying they're like, we want it to be the case that all men are born equal. I mean, they might very well want that as well, but what they're saying is like, no, this is already the case. Like, this is just, it's like that. Like, this is already how things are. So that's what I mean by like the American Revolution, the French Revolution as referendums on the social revolution. Another way that I mentioned James Vaughan earlier, another way that a way that he puts it that I like is he says that the American Revolution was not a country that had a revolution, but a revolution that had had our country. And here at the University of Auckland, I know there's a course on the American and French and Haitian revolutions called like the Atlantic Revolutions, which kind of captures this idea that like it was a feeling of the new and the different that couldn't be suppressed. The genie was out of the bottle. Bourgeois society was already spreading around the world. It was a kind of a cosmopolitan a kind of worldview, as Immanuel Kant called it. It was, as he also put it in another essay, it was an age of enlightenment, not an enlightened age. So it wasn't the end point, but rather it wasn't the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning, right? Okay, so here's a famous piece by Benjamin Constant, who's a French statesman writing in the year 1819, where he compares ancient and modern society and where he really puts a finer point on some of the stuff, some of the ideas I've been discussing. So on ordinary conceptions of liberty, he says, first ask yourselves, gentlemen, what an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a citizen of the United States of America understand today by the word liberty. For each of them, it is the right to be subjected only to the laws and to be neither arrested, detained, put to death, or maltreated in any way by the arbitrary will of one or more individuals. It is the right of everyone to express his opinion, choose a profession and practice it, to dispose of property and even to abuse it, to come and go without permission and without having to account for his motives or undertakings. It is everyone's right to associate with other individuals, either to discuss their interests or to profess the religion that he and his associates prefer, or even simply to occupy their days or hours in a way that is most compatible with his inclinations and whims. Finally, it is everyone's right to exercise some influence on the administration of the government, either by electing all or particular officials, or through representations, petitions, demands to which the authorities are more or less compelled to pay heed. So that's what is understood today by the word liberty. Now he's going to compare that with the ancients. He says, now compare this liberty with that of the ancients. The latter consisted in exercising collectively but directly several parts of the complete sovereignty, in deliberating in the public square over war and peace, in forming alliances with foreign governments, in voting laws, in pronouncing judgments, in examining the accounts, the acts, the stewardship of the magistrates, in calling them to appear in front of the assembled people, in accusing, condemning, or absolving them. But if this was what the ancients called liberty, they admitted as compatible with its collective freedom the complete subjection of the individual to the authority of the community. You find among them almost none of the enjoyments we have just seen form part of the liberty of the moderns. All private actions were submitted to a severe surveillance. No importance was given to individual independence, neither in relation to opinions, nor to labour, nor above all to religion. The right to choose one's own religious affiliation, a right that we regard as one of the most precious, would have seemed to the ancients a crime and a sacrilege. So, he goes on, thus among the ancients, the individual, almost always sovereign in public affairs, was a slave in all his private relations. As a citizen, he decided on peace and war. As a private individual, he was constrained, watched, and repressed in all his movements. As a member of the collective body, he interrogated, dismissed, condemned, beggared, exiled, or sentenced to death his magistrates and superiors. As a subject of the collective body, he could himself be deprived of his status, stripped of his privileges, banished, put to death by the discretionary will of the whole to which he belonged. Okay, so it's a bit of a long quote, and I hope I didn't lose you, but I'll just summarize it basically. Like, he's contrasting two kinds of democracy. On the one hand, participatory democracy, which in his view is only possible really in small communities. Like, for instance, if you consider that ancient Athens had a similar population to like a large university or a large university town maybe, that's kind of what he means. Whereas representative democracy, which you mentioned earlier, Theo, relieves ordinary citizens from the burden of decision making, enabling a division of labour within political life. So Constant is drawing a distinction here between state and society. These are terms that we bandy about in a haphazard fashion and kind of conflate them or apply very specific meanings to them in the ordinary common sense way of putting it. But the tradition of the Enlightenment and of classical liberalism that came out of it has a very precise conception of each term that in which each is differentiated from the other. So democracy is not in the realm of the social, but in politics. And politics is concerned with the state, right? With ensuring minimum interference in individuals' affairs with a small state. That's kind of what the classical liberalism that came out of the early to mid 19th century was aiming at. So again, to go back to the Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, this notion of the people, by the people, for the people. In order to be for the people, you need to ensure that there's a certain non-interference in the lives of those people so that they can carry out their private affairs. And as I already mentioned, in this new like market, commercial, civil society that we saw, beginning roughly in the late 15th century and early 16th century, you begin seeing people relating to each other on the basis of their labour. So private individuals all of a sudden are travelling far and wide in order to sell their labour on the free market, and it's through that individual enterprise that society is supposed to prosper as a whole. The general wealth or the common weal is supposed to be advanced through this kind of process of, to quote Kant again, this social unsociability, where people are individually kind of self-interested, but on the whole, everyone kind of benefits from it. Whereas Bernard Mandeville put it, private vice is public virtue. So post-revolutionary societies had based themselves not on rule of the people, but the rule of law. Where democracy, if we think of it as rule of the people, that's one thing, but then on the other hand, you need to ensure that the majority aren't going to bring about a social order in which democracy itself collapses. And that's where this notion of checks and balances come from in modern republicanism, constitutions. Also the notion of civil liberties, safeguarding the minority against the majority or the minority against the state. Things like the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, all these sorts of notions are really important. So those are some like ends of democracy. If we think of democracy in terms of means, however, it's kind of takes on a different character. Democracy as means here is kind of like democracy not as a system, but democracy as a method, if you like. So Alexis de Tocqueville, this French statesman who was writing around the time of the American and French Revolutions, praised democracy not for what it is, but for what it leads people to do. So that quote again is not for what it is, but for what it leads people to do. So in this sense, I get the impression that it's kind of suggesting that like, even if democracy is just a lie, it is at least a noble lie because it leads people to advance the case of democracy. But the question is whether democracy is in fact a lie, and whether democracy can and should extend to all of society rather than just the state, right? Whether democracy is a matter for every individual aspect of people running their own lives, if that's something they should consciously take up, or if it should just be appointees that they select to advocate on their behalf in the government. So the question is whether individuals are to act democratically through economic, fraternal, or even domestic arenas in civil society, or whether they should at the same time favour like decentralisation, collectivisation, participation, these kind of like pseudo or proto-anarchist kind of ideals. Okay, what I've covered so far, just to recap, is civil, commercial, bourgeois society, however you want to translate it, and the right of labour as being enshrined in these new revolutions that begin to sweep the Atlantic world at the very least. And what that produces is a new way of relating to the world that is predicated on a certain morality that one's life should not be defined at the outset, but one should be able to define one's own life through relating to others, and through doing that through work, right? A fair day's pay for a fair day's work, the right to not be discriminated against, the right to have a fair share in the goings on of the state. But what troubles that is, of course, capitalism. And if we want to understand how Marxism thought of politics, and specifically how it thought of democracy, we need to understand first what capitalism is and how that bears out in returning to the memory of the social revolution, of the democratic revolutions that arose again under everyone's nose in bourgeois society. Capitalism might be thought of as a stable entity, as like a fixed thing, as like an economic system that we can think our way outside of if we merely design a better system. But if we were to think of it like that, we would miss out on a much more nuanced view that accounts for what classical Marxism thought of it is. So we might think of capitalism then not as like a thing, but a process. And in order to be a process, meaning like something that's in transition, something that moves, we need to think of it both subjectively and objectively. And that implies a certain kind of reflective capacity on our part to understand ourselves as being reproduced by capitalism, and our consciousness being the product of this new form of society. And when I say new form of society, I basically mean like capitalism has done something to the social relations of bourgeois society, and I'll get into that in greater detail, but right now we might simply think of it as a crisis, and crisis here just extending from the ancient Greek sense of the word, kritik, or I don't know how to correctly pronounce it, it's like K-R-I-T-I-K, which basically refers to like a decision point or a moment of change. It has a medical connotation in the sense of like an illness might progress in the sense that it might get worse and something needs to be done about it. So the question is, what does it mean for bourgeois society to progress? And can something be done about it when you've got capitalism? The same question might be asked of capitalism, like what happens when capitalism advances or progresses? Marx's method for understanding this is what is known as a dialectical immanent critique. So I've already kind of addressed what critique and immanence is. Simply means like, well, critique is like reflecting upon the conditions of possibility for change, and for understanding that critical moment, if you like, that critical transition point, and reflecting on it, the objective transition point in a subjective way. Immanent just means from within, and then dialectical means like a two-part system or a two-part view of things. So here, if we just take up the terms subjective and objective, we might also think of it in terms of like the economic and the political of state and society. It has many different registers. But Marx's dialectical immanent critique applies to phenomena, which is a word that simply means that which appears or that which presents itself to us. So basically, as long as something is thought up or conceived of or presents itself in the world in private or public affairs, that can be taken up as a valid object of critique for us to understand what made this come into being and what crisis is it an expression of, right? So I think it's Siegfried Kracauer, if I'm not mistaken, it might be someone else from the early Frankfurt School precursors that we read in our primary syllabus, who says basically that even the most superficial forms of contemporary reality can be taken up as an expression of the underlying crisis of society, to paraphrase. So he uses the example of like the Tiller Girls, these kind of choreographed dances in silent films, or it might be early sound actually, to try and get at the question of like, what is this underlying crisis? By which he basically means a contradiction. And I already talked about bourgeois social relations a little bit. To properly understand what capitalism is then as a process of transition, of unresolved transition specifically, we need to understand what is being, what bourgeois social relations are being contradicted by. And simply, we can start with the Industrial Revolution, of course. You know, people date it between 1750 and 1850, its origins. But aside from all the empirical history stuff about like when the power loom and the cotton gin, the steam engine were invented, we might simply think in terms of what it represents. So whereas bourgeois social relations were predicated upon the right of free labour and the ability of individuals to travel freely and to not to be discriminated against by the state, and in doing so to contribute to the wealth of all of society that will spread across the world. All those principles are undermined and are threatened to be destroyed by the invention of industrial technology, simply because all of a sudden you have a society predicated on labour, but what begins to happen is that the Industrial Revolution drives down wages and threatens to put people out of work. So on the one hand, people are calling for more jobs, but society is unable to offer that anymore. And that is precisely how capitalism continues to reproduce itself. We might think of capitalism here as a kind of revolution in the sense that it is continually reinventing itself in order to preserve this basic contradiction that is underlying society. So just to really put it in simple terms, capitalism is the crisis of bourgeois society. And this is Marx's conception. So people say Marx doesn't say very much about politics, so they try and project other theories onto him. They try and kind of make him into like a theorist of democracy, who just wants like more rights for everyone, who's really against like the bosses and the rich and powerful, that he's a muckraker, that he's somehow trying to like perform an expose on this dirty capitalist economic system that he just wants to wish away or something. But rather, we might understand Marx's politics by understanding his theory of society. So in order to understand Marx, neither as a debunker or some kind of utopian, in the lay sense, we can understand that which he shows to be in crisis. So everything I've said up to this point about bourgeois society being predicated on the right of labour, being undermined by the industrial forces of production, we might think of as freedom crisis, where freedom is the necessity of labour to become the principle under which society conducts its affairs. All of a sudden, that is threatened to be outstripped and destroyed by the continual self-revolutionizing process of capitalism. And just for historical context, we're looking at like the 1840s when Marx really comes of age, and I'll return to this when I start talking about Bonapartism and the revolutions of 1848 in a minute. But I just want to quickly put a finer point on what freedom meant for Marx. So this is a quote from the Grundrisse, which is, it translates like blueprint, I guess, which is kind of a draft, I suppose, for Das Kapital. He writes, "What is progress, if not the absolute elaboration of humanity's creative dispositions, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself, the absolute movement of becoming? The ancient conception in which man always appears, in however narrowly national, religious, or political a definition, as the aim of production, seems very much more exalted than the modern world, in which production is the aim of man, and wealth the aim of production. In fact, however, when the narrow bourgeois form has been peeled away, what is wealth, if not the universality of needs, capacities, enjoyments, productive powers, etc., of individuals produced in universal exchange? What, if not the full development of human control over the forces of nature, those of his own nature as well as those of so-called nature? What, if not the absolute elaboration of his creative dispositions, without any preconditions other than antecedent historical evolution, which make the totality of this evolution, i.e. the evolution of all human powers as such, unmeasured by any previously established yardstick, an end in itself? What is this, if not a situation where man does not reproduce in any determined form, but produces his totality, where he does not seek to remain something formed by the past, but is in the absolute movement of becoming? In bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and the destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so insofar as we seek for closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or where it appears to be satisfied with itself is vulgar and mean." Okay, so this is Marx really trying to articulate what freedom means in modern society as opposed to the ancient, while managing to raise this question of self-undermining, this idea of a society suffering from its own inability to realize itself and unable to make good on its own promises and potentials. This is a point that Louis Menand, who I quoted from earlier, really helps to bring out. He says, if Marxism gave a meaning, sorry, there's no if there, he says, Marxism gave a meaning to modernity. It said that, wittingly or not, the individual performs a role in a drama that has a shape and a goal, a trajectory, and that modernity will turn out to be just one act in that drama. Historical change is not arbitrary. It is generated by class conflict. It is faithful to an inner logic. It points toward an end, which is the establishment of the classless society. Marxism was founded on an appeal for social justice, but there were many forms that such an appeal might have taken. Its deeper attraction was the discovery of meaning, a meaning in which human beings might participate in history itself. Marx and Engels were the philosophers of a second enlightenment. So, thinking about the idea of Marx and Engels as the philosophers of a second enlightenment, well, first of all, what's a philosopher? It's like a cultured individual, like a man of letters, a spokesperson for one's time, I guess, that comes out of the Enlightenment, kind of a Rousseauian type figure. And here we've got the second enlightenment. And the question is, well, what is the second enlightenment? Well, it's this era when it's necessary, it becomes necessary to give meaning to it, where the old expressions of the first enlightenment are no longer seem relevant, or they fall into distress. And that means that Marx and Engels need to kind of rise to the occasion of speaking for it, as it would, and that's kind of what Menand seems to think about them. So I've already discussed this question of Bonapartism a bit, and I'm going to return to it now because I think it helpfully kind of concretizes some of the more abstract notions I've been discussing so far. one of the biggest anxieties people have had historically about democracy is that it can go from rule by the people to merely rule for the people. Again, I'm invoking the Gettysburg Address there. So democracy can go from rule by the people to merely rule for the people. And here the question of domination enters the equation. If we have some kind of if we entertain for a second the notion that there might be a possible form of democracy that exists, an appeal to the majority of people to rule and to make society reflect their interests, what's stopping them from being corralled or whipped into a kind of false way of thinking? Well, the biggest mistake people make in thinking is that we already have a kind of democracy that is betrayed and undermined by the ruling class, which kind of holds this sort of view, this kind of like elitist theory of democracy or a class theory of democracy where a certain province of the wealthy and the moneyed are somehow able to corral public opinion, or that they themselves have access to better education because simply they have more money and they can make more informed votes, and that is the true interest that society reflects, not an authentic, genuine, quote-unquote democracy from below. But to be authentic to the view that Marxism took, following this dialectical immanent critique of the crisis of bourgeois society, we might instead understand how democracy is inevitable, but also impossible at the same time. So democracy is necessary under capitalism, but it is also unable to realize the potentials of capitalism. It's unable to go beyond and through capitalism, which was kind of Marx's conception of the way forward for the proletariat. And this is all to say basically that democracy is epiphenomenal of this crisis. So the word epiphenomenal just simply means like a byproduct. It's not the phenomenal form of expression, but that which is produced by it. It's the effect, not the cause. So if democracy is the effect, not the cause of this crisis, we can ask what that means. Again, to return to this notion of democracy as necessary or inevitable, okay, what does that look like? Well, what we know is that we have this condition known as proletarianization, this idea of being dispossessed from one's labour, which for Marx begins to really occur in the 19th century. This great like the new multitudes that begin springing up in Europe that are no longer like the free mercantile kind of everymen of the third estate that brought the revolution, the French Revolution, to its conclusion, but rather they are unable to voice their discontents other than through their immiseration, right? And what this signals for Marx is that this process of proletarianization, this new condition of like mass homelessness, for instance, or rather mass unemployment, which helps to produce homelessness, I guess. What the signals for Marx is that capitalism is basically organizing us whether we like it or not. It is the great equalizer. It's kind of regarding us all as equally able to be thrown out of a job. And the question then, to return to the matter of democracy and politics, is one of social and political leadership and responsibility. So is a factory responsible only to its own employees or to society as a whole? Another way to put it is, who is leading whom? Who is leading whom? That's one way we might think of politics. And now to really illustrate Bonapartism, which is a term I've used multiple times without properly explaining, but I'll do that now. You've got this period of the Hungry 40s and the 1840s, which is an era marked by depression and new like famines that sweep Europe, and it's kind of the reason that I'm here today, actually, because my ancestors lived through the Irish potato famine and came to New Zealand as a result. This Hungry 40s period produced mass social discontents, which included a call for a step in the direction of socialism by the so-called utopian socialists, some of whom gained a great amount of success at the state level, and one of whom was Louis Bonaparte, who appointed a number of these utopian socialists to his cabinet and tried to establish these kind of national workshops so that people could be put back into employment. And they were enormously successful, only to be squashed because Louis Bonaparte, who's Napoleon's nephew, couldn't raise enough funds from other monarchs in Europe. But the key thing is that he himself wasn't a monarch. He was, the leader of the republic, but he made himself the monarch. So that's why Marx remarked that it was first time as tragedy, second time as farce. He crowned himself emperor, just like his uncle. And funnily enough, it was just as the statesman Guizot proclaimed, "C'est le triomphe définitif du socialisme," which means this is the complete and final triumph of socialism, which he said right as Louis Bonaparte staged his coup in December 1852, crowned himself emperor after serving one term, which was like the maximum term that you could serve as the leader of the French Republic. So Bonapartism here doesn't necessarily mean one man. The point I'm really describing is one that for Marx is much broader than that. It's a social condition that is brought about by society's crisis, as it were. It's a condition that really has less to do with individual figures and despots and tyrants than the state, right? And what he's talking about is the state mediating the contradiction between capital and labour, the state mediating this crisis of the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. So the way that Marx puts it is that the bourgeoisie cannot rule and the proletariat are not yet ready to rule. Under this condition, it is necessary, in order for capitalism to continue, to have a state, an organised state that has a monopoly on violence against the working class, or that, which I should say puts the classes against each other, that is able to maintain its order. So these periodic crises that we all hear about under capitalism, recessions, depressions, inflation, wars of conquest, boom and bust, like these are all byproducts of this underlying capitalism, and they are mediated by the state. So after this experience of the 1848 revolutions, which were huge, by the way, no one really talks about them these days, but they threatened to overturn Europe. They swept Austria, Hungary, Italy, Germany, and other places too, I think. That after their failure and after witnessing what happened in France, Marx writes a letter to his friend Wedemeyer in the year 1852, when he writes, "And now, as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic economy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, one, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and three, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." So I just need to underscore really how significant that is. It's important to let that sink in. He says, "No credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. Long before me, all that's been done by bourgeois historians and political economists. What I did that was new was that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and three, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society." Okay, so the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. What does that mean? Communism, right? Well, certainly, but we also need to think to what end? What does communism signify and what is communism trying to bring about? there's that quote, which I think is from the Communist Manifesto, where Marx is like, he says, the free development of each is the precondition for the free development of all, or there's the notion of from each according to his labour to each according to his need. These kind of rallying cries, I guess, that have been taken up by communists to mean like that we need this new, fairer, more egalitarian society. Yes, like egalitarian and like certainly fairer, but the question hangs over that of the question is one of democracy. Like, is democracy a means to the end of communism, or is communism a means to the end of democracy? And the way that Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, this peculiar phrasing, is where they call it the battle of democracy. This is a short quote. They say, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy." And the way I try and understand this is by thinking again about this thought figure of the Battle of Gettysburg here. You know, like the Battle of Gettysburg, that pairing of words isn't like when you say like a battle of guns or a battle of swords. It's not like Gettysburg was what was the type of battle, but rather it was a battle that took place on the terrain of Gettysburg. Likewise, for Marx and Engels, what they're saying is that the battle of democracy is a battle that takes place on the terrain of democracy. So the contradiction underlying democracy is one that needs to be brought to its fullest development. It needs to be made to advance, to progress. And that is to say that democracy must be overcome. So when in this quote, Marx and Engels are talking about how the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, they're basically saying that there needs to be a condition where the working class are carrying out the function of the state. And that is basically what the dictatorship of the proletariat exists to do. It's like the what is now the formal, hollowed out function of the, not function, what am I trying to say? The state is emptied of its contents, just like an empty form of what it represented in a bourgeois society, which was simply a means to the end of establishing the free development of all, but now, is something kind of that has become empty. What Marx and Engels are saying is that working class need to take responsibility for this, because it is they who are society, who are producing the fruits of society. To put a finer point on it, I'll turn to Lenin. Lenin and his peers in the Second International, people like Luxemburg and Trotsky and others who represent kind of the radicals of that tradition, who were trying to really take up who were trying to realize this organized mass grouping of socialists in the Second Working Men's Association or Second International to its fullest conclusions. What they're trying to understand is how to go in and through democracy. Like, what precisely is the method, or what precisely is the way forward? How is democracy to be overcome exactly? Here we might think of democracy then as a means to an end, not an end in itself, but not in the same way that I alluded to at the very start of the teaching, where I talked about democracy as a method that simply means like, what Alexis de Tocqueville mentioned as being like kind of as a positive thing, in that like it makes people practiced at working towards a state of democracy, or this kind of like, again, proto-anarchist kind of ideal of like full participation or direct democracy, radical democracy, collectivization, all that sort of thing. Rather, for the radicals of the Second International, democracy is a means to an end, in the sense that it is a way through the crisis on the very terrain of the crisis itself. And I know that sounds a little bit cryptic, but I'll just bear with me, and I think it'll hopefully start to make sense. Here's a quote by Rosa Luxemburg. She says, "In a word, democracy is indispensable, not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. So democracy is indispensable, not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. So it's on the basis of what democracy brings to fruition, or rather brings to crisis, I should say, that we're able to judge it as a yardstick for the possibility of revolution. It's on the basis of the social democratic forms of revolution that came before, such as the French and American, the other revolutions, that we might see how we can no longer return to that. We have to move forward to a proletarian form of revolution. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Second International Radicals, but I've basically touched upon them, and I don't want to detour too much through the history. But basically the point is that people like Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, they're not trying to bring about the revolution so much as strengthen the revolutionary forces through engaging with this tradition of critique, through the practice of self-reflection. So they're kind of like saying, yes, build democracy, yes, engage with mainstream forms of politics, like that's all well and good. But no, don't liquidate into Proudhonism, who's an anarchist. Don't liquidate into Lassalleanism, who's kind of like a state kind of socialist figure. Right? They're trying to bring out like the vicissitudes of democracy, the sharp turning points that head towards a logical conclusion that is not desirable. So here we might ask, well, what did Marxism want? Like, what was it positively trying to achieve? It's a tricky question because we've never had a successful implementation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. We've never lived in a communist or socialist society, and even were we to, we were reared under capitalism, and it would only be our children or their children's children or their children's children's children that would be able to potentially see the fruits of that society, and who knows. But broadly speaking, Marxism has the same goal as the anarchists, but disagrees on the method. So when Marxism is talking about realizing freedom through kind of eminently exploring it as a contradiction under capitalism, what that means is, well, I'll quote from Marx because he addresses it head on. He says, freedom consists in converting the state from an organ superimposed upon society into one completely subordinate to it. And today too, the forms of state are more free or less free to the extent that they restrict the freedom of the state. That's what he writes in the Critique of the Gotha Program. So he's saying that on the one hand you've got the state, and on the other hand you've got society. And whereas in bourgeois society the ideal was that the state would help to realize society and social relations, what you have under capitalism is this condition of Bonapartism, where the state is necessarily superimposed upon society. The state dominates society and makes it subordinate to it, restricting its freedom. Whereas for socialism and communism, you would have a condition wherein freedom means being social, I guess, like this organic social impulse, this social-ism, the social-ism would hopefully be able to find its full expression. Now, you might have noticed that through the course of this teaching, I've kind of skipped over the 20th century. That was deliberate, basically, because I wanted to hang a question mark over it, being like, okay, what's happened in between this time that Marx and Engels and their immediate followers were writing, and where are we today? How do we get from this place where classical liberalism was seen as like a necessary measure to ensure the free participation of all in society, but democracy, rule of the majority, was like a threat to that, because the majority could be corralled into endorsing despotism or whatever else. How do we get from that to a condition today where basically everyone agrees that everyone agrees with the basic premises of democracy? Where, again, to use my thought figure from earlier, democracy is like this a silent letter in a word. Like it's an unspoken premise that everyone kind of proceed from. the question would be like, yeah, has democracy turned into a gross caricature of itself? Are sections on the left right to call for a direct or informal or participatory kind of democracy in the family and the community and in the workplace, where people have to be trained out of the bad habits that they were taught under capitalism, their wrong thinking that is undemocratic, and that only through starting a bike repair shop, I don't know, or starting like a Zen coffee house, that they can experience in direct terms what cooperation means. I mean, I'm being a bit like frivolous with my and being unfair to people that believe this stuff, but it does come from a reasonable place. Ultimately, it seems it's plausible to like latter-day anarchists. Are sections of the left right to call for formal democracy? Like, is that another thing that people, like through participation in the state, this kind of millennial socialist vision of like, we just need to get like socialism at the ballot box, we need to get Bernie or Corbyn in, and then we'll have a greater representation of the grassroots in Parliament or wherever else in the Senate and in the executive branch in the White House. Well, here's what Marx would say to all of that. And I quite like this quote. He says, this is from Critique of the Gotha Program, he says, according to section 2 of the Gotha Program, the German Workers' Party strives for the free, quote, the free state. Free state? What is this? So he's kind of like incredulous at the notion of a free state. It's kind of like, it's just a contradiction in terms. Like, the state is the antithesis of freedom. It's holding back and threatening to undermine and destroy freedom, right? Now, I've only got a few more kind of points to raise, and most of them are basically from Lenin. And I think this is like a suitable place to really round out what I've discussed today. And it's from his text, The State and Revolution, which we've got sitting on the table over there, where he really talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat and what this kind of, how this battle of democracy, as it were, would play out. So this is from chapter 5. He says, only in communist society, when the resistance of the capitalists have disappeared, when there are no classes, i.e. when there's no distinction between the members of society as regards their relation to the social means of production, only then the state ceases to exist, and it becomes possible to speak of freedom. Only then will a truly complete democracy become possible and be realized, owing to the simple fact that, freed from capitalist slavery, from the untold horrors, savagery, absurdities, and infamies of capitalist exploitation, people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary or first rules of social intercourse that must have been known, I just slipped that word in accidentally, that have been known for centuries and repeated for thousands of years in all copybook maxims. They will become accustomed to observing them without force, without coercion, without subordination, without the special apparatus for coercion called the state. And so in capitalist society, we have a democracy that is curtailed, wretched, false, a democracy only for the rich, for the minority. The dictatorship of the proletariat, the period of transition to communism, will, for the first time, create democracy for the people, for the majority, along with the necessary suppression of the exploiters, of the minority. Communism alone is capable of providing really complete democracy, and the more complete it is, the sooner it will become unnecessary and wither away of its own accord. Okay, few key ideas there, hold them in your mind. I'm going to keep reading this time from chapter 4. It is constantly forgotten that the abolition of the state means also the abolition of democracy, that the withering away of the state means the withering away of democracy. At first sight, this assertion seems exceedingly strange and incomprehensible. Indeed, someone may even suspect us of expecting the advent of a system of society in which the principle of subordination of the minority to the majority will not be observed, for democracy means the recognition of this very principle. No, Democracy is not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority. Democracy is a state which recognizes the subordination of the minority to the majority, i.e. an organization for the systematic use of force by one class against another. Here he's evoking Engels' notion of the state as special bodies of armed men, like for instance the police and the military, those who are capable of enacting violence in order to preserve capitalism. An organisation for the systematic use of force by one class against another, by one section of the population against another. So again, like, it's not just that democracy is, like he says, it's not identical with the subordination of the minority to the majority, but an organised state that does that through the use of force systematically. And finally, to return to this question of freedom in society, Lenin says, lastly, only communism makes the state absolutely unnecessary, for there is nobody to be suppressed. Nobody in the sense of a class, of a systematic struggle against a definite section of the population. We are not utopians and do not in the least deny the possibility and inevitability of excesses on the part of individual persons, or the need to stop such excesses. In the first place, however, no special machine, no special apparatus of suppression is needed for this. This will be done by the armed people themselves, as simply and as readily as any crowd of civilized people, even in modern society, interferes to put a stop to a scuffle or to prevent a woman from being assaulted. And secondly, we know that the fundamental social cause of excesses, which consist in the violation of the rules of social intercourse, is the exploitation of the people, their want and their poverty. With the removal of this chief cause, excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. We do not know how quickly and in what succession, but we do know they will wither away. With their withering away, the state will also wither away. So just to really sum up what Lenin's trying to express there and where he's getting it from in Marxism, we have no politics but the crisis of all politics, and we have no democracy but the crisis of all democracy. Simply, democracy and capitalism are two sides of the same coin. If we limit our thinking of capitalism to an economic threat to bourgeois social relations, that's kind of a too simplistic way to look at it, but if we just entertain that, then we could conceive of democracy as a political crisis. So this guy Dick Howard, who writes this book called The Spectre of Democracy, calls modern democracy a challenge that must be lived up to, as a spectre that haunts us. And this is what Marx basically means by democracy as the secret of all constitutions. And what we see through Bonapartism, which again is not just like Bonaparte, but we can also trace it to or find instances of it in the Prussian state under the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, or Wilsonian democracy in World War I, Roosevelt in the Great Depression, Stalinism, fascism, all these forms of the state trying to resolve the contradictions of capitalism precisely by reinventing capitalism. All of these prove that the state will destroy its own constitution, in fact, to maintain Bonapartism. So we can say that radical democracy, in a certain sense, leads to socialism, but only by way of contradiction. Hence, Marxism is not really just about class struggle, but the very liquidation or disintegration of class struggle. Marxism is about trying to apprehend the meaning of this very liquidation and disintegration, but understanding how it's necessary as symptomatic or expressive of the advance or progressed state of capitalism. So democracy qua the disintegration of society, democracy as the disintegration of society, is expressing the unmet task. We're competing for a bigger slice of the pie, and yet we're also falling out of the working class all the time. And capitalism is democratizing us all through that process, but the question is what we're going to do about it. That's my teaching. Thank you for listening. You've been a great audience.
Sure. I think it was like yeah, dope.
Cool. Any questions?
No, you know your stuff so well. That was really enlightening. I took lots of notes, so I want to thank you very much.
I saw you taking notes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was really enjoyable. Because these days, I'm so grateful that we've got democracy, that we can speak out that it's indispensable, but it's crazy how it is out there. You know, it should be a waste not, want not. Like, I see so many people overconsume at malls, and I just avoid malls altogether. Because I know that, you know, human exploitation in Chinese factories making clothing and certain products. Like, I try and buy clothes that last for 10 years and that kind of stuff. And, you know, because it's just horrible having that sense of water, that there's water scarcity and all the brand new clothes are just dumped in the ocean. You know, that's I think that's a part where democracy goes really wrong with not, even in a country of New Zealand, which is only 5 million people, that people will still spend heaps on Christmas presents, no matter how much they feign to be struggling or something. They will spend heaps on credit cards or Christmas presents and stuff like that. So it's really weird. It's really weird. You know, this the whole COVID thing and taking a step back. I'm pleased that we have a democratic society, because I don't agree with some things that happen. I'm pleased I don't come from a third or fourth world country, because I've seen things in those countries that I didn't. You know, there was also always a cross-cultural comparison. That they were really great countries to visit. But there's things that happen, like in Southeast Asia, if you live there, it's like, what the hell? You know, for the cross-cultural comparison. Yeah, no, you know your politics stuff really well, because that's one thing that America is really and not stable with the democracy as a political crisis. People really don't know, do they? They don't know if they get what they vote for and all that kind of stuff. You know, they just carry on doing their own thing in their nuclear families, but you know, something's really wrong sometimes with policy and stuff. Like their space treaty, how much they spend on space, missions to space for asteroid mining and stuff like that. It's a phenomenal amount of money that's probably quite, I believe, it's really quite wasteful. That messes with the Earth's natural frequency of radiation. Like a rocket, $80 million each time a rocket launches and propels off. And it affects the ozone layer over here, particularly in New Zealand and Australia. Hence why in summer it's, you know, quite a battle. Do not get sunburned, yeah.
There are, you know, this crisis has many implications.
I think that's like something that came out nicely in the teacher is the dimensionality of democracy is like as like you said the other side of the coin, right? And the sort of connections.
Like capitalism
they become legible, right?
Yeah, capitalism has produced democracy, and of course, like we can.
And you know, obviously the crisis of production.
Yeah. We can cast our view back to like ancient Athens, obviously, and we can be like, oh, democracy is like thousands of years old, but like it isn't, and it isn't in the sense that it's like it's an old form, but it's gained new content under capitalism.
I don't want to like, it's hard because like any kind of public speaking for me just like defaults to stand-up comedy. But like
that's funny because any stand-up comedy for me defaults into public speaking.
A new crisis unlocks. But it's funny when you're talking about the list of like Bonapartism, like particularly in the context of the New Zealand context, like the gag writer in me wants to be like, you know, like in like, it's like, you got Michael Joseph Savage, and you're like, oh, look, and
Then you can start being really speculative and being like, and the 11th and the 12th and the 13th and 20th and 21st and 30th.
You know, but obviously, you know, Savage and Lonnie are just too, like, it's just hey, like, in here, we have like, maybe even like a clearer example of Wellington, right? But that's assuming people know what happened. But in terms of like the fundamental kind of like restructuring the tearing apart of society to preserve the crisis is just like, here it is, right? Hey, why not? We'll do it. Welfare state. I don't know why it took so long to Georgia.
Well, it'll be interesting in a couple of weeks, 12 days, I should say.
Well, let's destroy the welfare state.
Well, when we do our panel on the Green Party of New Zealand, because that will be really raising the question. I hope, like the question in the room of like what does democracy signify as like a rallying call? Because I think it's fair to say that the Greens are like the expression of like progressivism as like a movement, like progressive liberalism, which is captured quite nicely in the phrase like rad lib. You know, it kind of implies like we're progressing all the way with liberalism, all the way, we're radical about it.
There's kind of one thing that struck me though, right, is like when you're talking about like when these sort of like anarcho or like horizontalist kind of protests, or like this idea that like this ideal form of democracy that we've been removed from through like the oligarchy or through elite meddling or through power peddling or lobbying or whatever. In some ways it's almost like a partial apprehension, right, of like wanting to like complete democracy, right? Like you know, it's wanting there's almost like the apprehension, like, right, we need to like it needs to.
So you're talking about anarchists currently in like this impulse towards informal democracy?
Like when you were talking about just before you did the quote about like a free state, what is that? Right? And then you kind of like summarized a couple of sort of like popular contemporary ideas on like democracy, right? Like the sort of like, well, I'm not using this term like necessarily as a project of like thoughtless pro-democracy, where it's just like apprehended, just kind of like, we don't have a democracy, but like it would be cool if we did, right? And that's what we need to be getting to.
This is what democracy looks like. We are the 99%.
Sure, yes. That like there's something in terms of like a current, like if not like a common like apprehension, maybe even like a common orientation with this like idea that Lenin expresses in terms of like, obviously the fulfillment of democracy would be its destruction, would be its eradication, but like to get there needs to be I guess a purification, or like a working out. But the crisis needs to be
needs to be worked through.
And to be worked through, it needs to be like active, right? Like it needs to move.
Well, I'm not sure if this is the sense in which you mean the word active, but when you said active, what it brought up for me was like becoming conscious, or like making clear to oneself what is actually going on, which is not simply like meaning, you know, on an individual level, but like the movement for socialism, specifically as it's expressed in the party, needs to understand its own history and the kind of necessary character of that history. Here, necessary not meaning like teleological, like there's an endpoint in mind that it already knows in advance, but rather just knowing how what goes up must come down, kind of, to put it euphemistically. Like something's got to give, and it's only going to give through one of two ways. One is the preservation of the contradiction, and the other is through the kind of advancement of that contradiction, of that crisis.
A lot of people referring to the current situation as a crisis of democracy, referring to like the quote unquote populist leaders in America.
Like Trump and stuff.
Yeah. And they make a lot of references. They make a lot of references to like Weimar Germany, fascism from the emerging from them. Would this just be understood as part of the crisis of bourgeois society, understand it as Bonapartism kind of overtaking democracy, or is it more?
Well, it depends what you mean by this. Like what the antecedent there is. Are you referring to this talking point about demagogues threatening to undermine democracy? Like, is that what you're saying might be a byproduct of this underlying crisis? Or are you saying that the demagogues themselves are expressive of this crisis? Bit of both? Okay. The answer is yes. Like, for Marxism, all of like everything, well, it's not actually just for Marxism. It's like Marxism gets it from the radical Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau. Like for Rousseau, like everything in society that we take for granted extends from the division of labour and our capacity to mutually cooperate and enjoy our freedom on that basis. To remove ourselves from nature by reflecting on practice, through theory reflecting on practice, and to produce mutual cooperation that gives us the affordances and luxuries that we have. And what Marxism is trying to register is that the crisis of I'm just trying to kind of remember the through line of the question. So you asked if do you want to try rephrase the question, and I'll try and work through it.
It's just other people recognize it, referring to a crisis of democracy.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, it's tricky because, like, what do they mean by the crisis of democracy, and what does Marx mean by the crisis of democracy?
If they're like understanding a bit of the consciousness of democracy, it's in favor of, how do you put it, or if they're just trying to, I don't know, reconstitute it through Bonapartism.
Right. Well, it depends who.
The thing, just when you frame it like that, the thing that has kind of been lost, I think, by the way that I've seen it used, is that and this is like the wankiest possible way to formulate it, but it's like this is the crisis of democracy, right? Like this thing here is the crisis, right? Not like this is an expression of the crisis.
Hold on, wait.
That democracy is within a crisis.
Can you put that in more concrete terms?
The crisis is localized in the phenomenon of like Bolsonaro.
Right.
That like this is the crisis specifically as a situation.
So it kind of
not as an expression of a broader, like not as an expression of that, like not just like, hey, this is democracy, right?
Like
democracy is the crisis of democracy.
the way I would put it, and like it's a slightly more abstract way to put it, but for some reason, like it helps me think through it. Like the universal reveals itself in the particular. So as Hegel puts it, like that which is essential or underlying must appear. The essence, like, is bound by a certain necessity to come forth and make itself presented to us through our ability to apprehend it. And the difference between that and Marx is that Marx simply believes that, like, the appearance itself is contradictory and fragmented, and that so therefore the truth of the appearance is its falsity. I know that's kind of like tricky, but like it's non-identity or it's instability, it's disunity, right? And so whenever to return to the Krakauer quote I mentioned earlier, I think it's Krakauer, I might have the person who said it wrong. This notion that we can take up any like discrete, isolated phenomena under capitalist society, such as like a movie or choreographed dances in that movie, and try and understand them as a byproduct of the crisis of society. That everything extends from that source, if you like. Like that is what Marxism is trying to do. So when people say like Trump is like a populist rhetorician who's threatening to undermine democracy, it's very motivated and tendentious. Like when they say that I'm just thinking here of like, not even the Democrats, but like their mouthpieces. So like, the Washington Post, CNN, the New York Times, and that sort of thing. Like, they have a very vested interest in saying that, and they like are trying to do that in quite a, again, quite a motivated kind of way. So when they say like he's a threat to democracy, like they mean something very particular that relates to the notion of like their conception of democracy, I think, is like, and I'm really trying not to read them cynically. I'm really trying not to be like, oh, they just want their side to win and then that's good and fair and that's democratic. But to take them at their word, like, I guess they would think that like Trump is a demagogue who threatens to undermine society because he's going to like overrule like the Senate and the legislative branch by his executive orders. He's going to like be a madman in the White House with access to nuclear codes. Who's going to blow up the world, that sort of thing.
Are they like failing in that way to recognise, like they would preserve, like they want to preserve the crisis, but they're failing to recognise the necessity of the bonapartism of Trump to preserve the crisis?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm saying like they refer to like Hitler's legal ascendancy as like precedent for Trump's possible abuse of power.
Right.
So it's not saying that like, oh, there's a break from democracy in Trump. It's saying that democracy does bring about these figures and need to strengthen whatever checks and balances.
Yeah.
The state is in this case.
Right. I guess what they're really like, they use the word democracy there, but I feel like what they're really referring to there is like republicanism, which is like slightly different in that like republicanism is. I'm just going to shut this door. Give me one second.
It's really the majority. We've been drowned out.
My phone died.
I just motioned to the camera. I was like, "Who you want to?" So like
Just like speaking of microcosm, could you hear the laughing going on outside?
Oh, were they doing it tonight as well?
Yeah.
The laughers.
Oh, that's so funny.
I was just like,
I'm glad this is on record because I want other Platypus members to know, and people, if this gets uploaded online, I want people to know how funny that is.
it was just like, I don't know, like when you were talking about like the microcosm, like the Krakow concept, I was like, this absolute cynic in me is like as like Marxists, like now we're laughing in stereo, like laughing here and then like now we're doing Marxism.
Yeah. Okay, so like republicanism is like the rule of law, right? It's like a constant. It's not ruled by the people; it's ruled by law. And how it works in America is you've got the separation of powers, checks and balances, executive, legislative, and what's the other one? Judiciary, I guess. Yeah. For people who are critical of Trumpian democracy, let's call it that, basically they're saying that like we can't have a condition where people are voting for Trump. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what they're fucking saying. They're saying like, well, if this guy can get into power, then like we need to not have like whatever the hell this is. This ain't democracy, I mean, like infamously, there's Hillary Clinton's line about like the deplorables and that sort of thing. And people on the left try and take it up positively that like there's this movement called like MAGA communism where they're trying to be like, maybe we should like do this kind of like Trumpian style thing, but win them over to our like, because a lot of these people are working class, of course. A lot of black and Latino people vote for Trump, for instance. We need to win them over to like our neo-Stalinist conception of democracy, I guess.
Wouldn't it be like again to further like the appeal like the pollers that are like this is like the good bonapartism, right? Like we're gonna like trash this thing in order to preserve it, right? Like, that's
yeah. There you go. So that's actually a really good point, and that's kind of what I tried to raise at the end of my teaching, where I address like how in order to preserve bonapartism, like the state will destroy its own constitution. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. I mean, you literally, like, this is literally going on right now. Like, this is going on underneath our noses. Like, the attempt to bring
Well, you said
the Trump case, the Trump trial that got squashed by the Supreme Court. And it's like, yes, of course the Supreme Court squashed it because it was unconstitutional. Like,
I think the best articulation of this is like Freudian Trump, right? And then he's like, just vote for me this next time and you won't need to do it again. Like, what an expression of that, right? An expression of the wrecking ball of bipartisan, the healing. You ever play like the team shooter games? There's like the healer class.
The
in all
medic.
these games, the medic. And the medic always has a gun that heals their allies. You know, like shoot your allies to heal them. That's like the bipartisan, right?
I don't think we're playing the same Team Shooter game, but
They do.
I believe it.
It's, you know, a team fortress.
Yeah. I believe it.
There's always some contrivance, right?
Right.
But that's a stable.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing, right? Like this is the wrecking ball that is
Yeah.
medicinal.
Shooting democracy to heal it. I quite like that.
Yeah.
I wonder if we should end on that point.
Yeah.